All right, closing out our discussion from last week as we're dealing with Isaiah, Messianic prophecies in general, and specifically the Emmanuel prophecy found in Isaiah 7. I thought we had a great discussion. I like what I saw, not only in individual threads as you were dealing with the immediate historical context, but as we came together in my thread and looked at the issue of how, of what was Isaiah referring to, and how do we deal with dual fulfillment then? I think the consensus is that Isaiah, as we look at the historical context, was dealing specifically with his own immediate context, and he was referring to a child that would be born in his lifetime, would be born actually quite soon, because when the Syro-Ephraimite threat was on Judah and Ahaz, that threat went away rather quickly once Assyria came in. And of course, Isaiah presents that as, Ahaz should have trusted Yahweh, but Assyria was still Yahweh's agent in that. So if we agree that Isaiah was referring to a child born in his day, we have to ask ourselves, then what does it mean when Matthew says Christ fulfills that? Because if Jesus is fulfilling that, then was Isaiah wrong, or was he referring to that and something else? And that's where it gets a little bit more difficult, but that's where it becomes more interesting, because when we understand how specifically the New Testament, Matthew in particular, is using the phrase fulfillment, we get a better understanding of how we should read and what he's trying to teach us. When Matthew is talking about fulfillment, and we see this a little bit in the Sermon on the Mount, where Christ says, I didn't come to abolish the law, but to fulfill it. Of course, Jesus kind of gives us that pattern, and that he's given us the right interpretation. He's the fulfillment, the embodiment of what the Old Testament was all about. When we look at that in terms of fulfillment of prophecy, we see that Matthew is seeing in the birth of Jesus an embodiment of the child that was born and promised to Isaiah, a typological fulfillment instead of a direct, just one-to-one correspondence, because Isaiah is referring to a child that's going to be born in his own lifetime. But what Matthew's saying is, if we look at Jesus, we see that the same role, the same function that the Emmanuel child fulfilled, and the purpose that he served in his time, Jesus fulfills that in a greater way. He is a type of the Emmanuel child. He's born of a virgin, an actual virgin instead of just a young woman in Isaiah's day, and in that we see that the same role that the Emmanuel child served in his day, Christ serves that role, but in a greater way. So we see that in a time of uncertainty, of foreign oppression, of foreign threat, the Emmanuel child served as a reminder of Yahweh's reign, Yahweh's sovereignty, the reminder that he will be with his people, that he will establish justice, he will establish a right government. That is what the Emmanuel child, that's the function he served. Christ serves that function in a greater way. He was born of an actual virgin, and in a time of upheaval, that is the Roman oppression and sovereignty over the people in Israel, that Christ came to establish a better government. And he came to remind the people of Yahweh's sovereignty, that Yahweh was with the people in a greater way. So, and of course, it reminded him of his authority. In the book of Matthew, one of the major themes is Christ establishing his authority as Messiah. So we see that when Matthew is saying that Christ fulfills the Emmanuel prophecy, he's talking about more than just a one-on-one correspondence. He's talking about the entirety of that Emmanuel passage, and he is saying Christ is the embodiment of that. He fulfills it in that he is the Emmanuel par excellence. And that's how a lot of these prophecies and a lot of how the New Testament uses the Old Testament works, in that it will refer to one little part of the Old Testament, one little line, one little phrase, but he wants us to understand that he's invoking the entire thing, and that's what Matthew's invoking when he refers to the Emmanuel, and we see that he's doing a typological, not necessarily one-to-one correspondence. And that's how we have to deal with a lot of Old Testament prophecy, and that the New Testament's not just saying this was predicted and then here it is, because when we read a lot of these, the passages that the New Testament applies to Jesus as messianic prophecies, when you go to the original context, it seems to be a little out of place. Like, whoa, how do we know he's talking about Jesus? He was talking about someone else, and all of a sudden he slips this thing about Jesus in and then goes back. Well, no, we want to understand that he's referring to that, and he wants us to go back and look at the entirety of that context and understand that he's seeing Christ as the embodiment of that, as a typological fulfiller of it in a greater way. That doesn't take away from the predictive nature of the prophecy, but it does help us understand how the New Testament writers are seeing the Old Testament and seeing Christ, and that they see in Christ the embodiment of these principles and these promises that were all throughout the Old Testament. And that is a principle of interpretation that was very common in the first century when the New Testament was being written. And so we have to take that into account. And so when we look at any of the Messianic prophecies, as several of you pointed out, they're not always just talking about Jesus. In fact, in Isaiah, we get reference to Cyrus. He's called a Messiah. And so that's a Messianic prophecy? Yes. Is it a prophecy about Christ? Not Jesus. That's because he names someone else. But we have to understand that Messianic prophecies, in that they can refer to anyone who's anointed, but Jesus fulfills the type of a Messiah in a greater way. And this isn't to argue that the Old Testament wasn't looking forward to Christ. It's just saying that what the New Testament authors are doing is they are finding in Christ the embodiment of these promises of the Old Testament. They're saying he fulfills those in that way, in the same way that he fulfills the law. Not abolishing it, but showing us the right way to interpret it and embodying it in a greater way. So there's that. A little rambling there. I apologize. This is a real complicated subject, and it's something that's, it does real well in a discussion. For sitting in front of a camera here, it's a little difficult. But good job on the first week, first discussion. And I will be posting another video later today, and that will. If you're just watching this on Tuesday, it's already up. But if you're watching this on Monday morning, it'll be later today. I'll be posting a video introducing week 2.